Welcome and thank you for joining us on today's broadcast, The Road to Recovery for Veterans with Serious Mental Illness. This program is a presentation of the Department of Veterans Affairs Employee Education System in cooperation with the Mental Health Strategic Healthcare Group. I'm Rick Edlund. In 1999, the Surgeon General issued a groundbreaking report on mental disorders. The report concluded that while we know a great deal about treating mental illness, we still have a lot to learn about ways to prevent mental illness and promote mental health. The report also makes a clear connection between mental and physical health by stressing the fundamental importance of mental health to overall health and well-being. This is a sharp departure from centuries-old thinking which separated the two. Recognizing that mental disorders affect nearly 1 in 5 Americans in any given year, the Surgeon General's report emphatically points out that when untreated, these illnesses can be just as serious and disabling as physical diseases such as cancer and heart disease. In the past 20 years, medical and psychiatric researchers have made significant breakthroughs in diagnosing and treating mental illnesses. We've also learned that the road to recovery requires an array of services and support groups in addition to psychiatric treatment. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. In the next hour and a half, we're going to take a look at what VA is doing to provide an in-depth exposure to the essential elements of a recovery-oriented mental health system. After the broadcast, you should be able to explain the concept of recovery from mental illness, describe the stages of recovery for persons with serious mental illness, and what helps facilitate recovery at each stage, and summarize the essential paradigm shifts which must take place within our mental health and primary care systems in order to successfully implement comprehensive psychosocial services. We do have a lot of material to cover today, but first we're going to take a moment to meet our studio panel. Dr. Fred Fries, a consultant with the Summit County Recovery Project in Hudson, Ohio. Dr. Paul Carling, the founding consultant for the Center for Community Change International in Burlington, Vermont. Mo Armstrong, the co-director of the VinFen Corporation's Peer Educators Project in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And from our EES studios in Washington, D.C., Dr. Larry Lehman, VA's chief consultant with the Mental Health Strategic Healthcare Group in Washington, D.C. Gentlemen, thank you all for taking time from your busy schedules to be with us today. You at home will have the chance to call and talk with our panelists later in the broadcast. I'll give you the number to call when we open the phone lines. The road to recovery is a long, arduous journey. Dr. Fred Fries, you have taken that journey. Will you please tell us about it?
Well, I'm a veteran who is both a psychologist and a person diagnosed with schizophrenia. Some 36 years ago, when I was a young Marine Corps officer in charge of providing security for nuclear weapons and intelligence operations in Florida. Although I had served 2 years in Japan in 1966, at that time I was serving security duty in this country. This was, of course, during the Vietnam War. Several months into my assignment in this country, I made what was to me a discovery that certain high-ranking officers and other officials had been put under hypnotic control by a new weapon the communist enemy had. I went to report my discovery to the person I felt would know the most about hypnosis and brainwashing. That was the base psychiatrist. He agreed to see me right away. He interpreted my discovery as a delusion, much to my shock, and I was hospitalized for the next 5 months. During this time, I found out I was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. After taking that Thorazine and Stelazine for those 5 months in Bethesda, I received a medical discharge and spent the next 10 years repeatedly experiencing relapses and being rehospitalized. I was actually in military, county, state, and private hospitals, as well as being a patient for a time at the Veterans Administration Hospital in Chillicothe, Ohio. On one occasion, I was actually taken before a court and committed as an insane person in this fine hospital, originally called the Asylum for the Insane in Columbus, Ohio. Although I was last hospitalized in 1974, I've been receiving outpatient care from the Veterans Administration fairly continuously since that time. In spite of my condition, since leaving the service, I have been able to earn a degree from the American Graduate School of International Management in Phoenix, Arizona, and both master's and doctoral degrees in psychology from Ohio University. Actually, I've been able to maintain continuous employment as a psychologist or mental health administrator working in Ohio in the state system since the late 1960s. However, until about 15 years ago, I kept my condition very much a secret from virtually everyone. But I realized about that time that if all of us who were in fact able to recover fairly well from schizophrenia or other serious forms of mental illness all kept our recovery a secret, then no one would ever realize that anyone could actually recover from this disorder. So in the mid-1980s, I began first attending advocacy group meetings, and then identifying myself as a person with schizophrenia, and shortly thereafter I began giving talks identifying myself, and began then suggesting methods by which others with this disorder might benefit from my experience in learning to cope in working towards some semblance of recovery. The essence of my message for most folks is that schizophrenia, as in many of these disorders, can exist, it's very important, exist in various degrees of disability. It is not a matter of either being sane or insane. Some of us whose condition may not be so severe are able to function better than others from time to time. But increasingly, we can all look forward to a degree, no matter how disabled we are, of improvement in our ability to function. And medications and other treatments are getting better. We can improve regardless of our degree of disability. In schizophrenia, delusions and hallucinations, those positive symptoms, of course, are problematic. But from a practical standpoint, for most of us with this disorder, cognitive difficulties are what the thought disorganization mentioned in DSM-4 tends to be the most troubling aspect of our conditions. For many of us, our disorders tend to be episodic also, so sometimes they're more difficult than they are at other times. As we find ourselves reverting towards psychotic thought, we tend to over-connect ideas and concepts. We expand our horizons of meaningfulness, to use the phenomenologist Edmund Husserl's terms. When our minds are making wild and rapid associations, a major problem for us becomes one of staying focused enough so that we can stay connected with the thought processes of our chronically normal friends, whose thoughts remain comparatively restricted compared to what we're going through. At such times, our thoughts may be jumping from topic to topic in the minds of the normals, while the normal folks with whom we may be interacting remain more focused on topics of discussion. I find two factors helpful when I find myself entering such states. One is, of course, the antipsychotic medication. Increasing the dose that I take helps my overactive mind slow down to where I can stay reasonably focused. The other thing I find helpful is that I have to remember that when I speak, normals frequently have difficulty following my flow of thought. Therefore, I try to be very guarded during these times and not share automatically all of my thoughts with others. I am aware that there are only certain associations that normals can comfortably follow, and I try to speak in a manner that stays on the topic as I sense that the normals are capable of envisioning the topic of our conversation. I must always guard against being seen as rambling, circumstantial, or tangential in my discourse. In other words, I recognize that I have a serious cognitive disability, but I must work to control the tendency of my cognitive processes to get out of hand by judicious use of medicine and by limiting which of my thought processes I will openly share with others. For me, life becomes somewhat of a balancing act. I am constantly striving to stay connected with those around me, those in my social sphere. But to do this, I have to constantly translate my thoughts in such a way that they do not appear to be digressive or off the wall for those with whom I am conversing. Because of this coping strategy, I find I am constantly rehearsing how I am going to express my thoughts to others. Frequently, others observe me doing this rehearsing and think I'm talking to myself, which I am. This, of course, is a fairly common observation about persons with schizophrenia. But persons subject to psychosis, such as schizophrenia, manic depression, or schizoaffective disorder, we make up about 3% of the population. Mental health professionals who treat persons such as myself usually are aware of various psychosocial peculiarities that tend to accompany our disorders. There are many aspects to traveling on this road to recovery, one of which I have mentioned. Some time ago, I produced a summary actually of 12 aspects of coping that I feel are helpful for persons with serious mental illness. I've published these several times, and I've made them available to participants at this conference. You can also find them at my website, fredfries.com. Although I do not have the time to review all 12 approaches, 3 of the more important that I have delineated are as follows. 1, disorganization. And this is not just of thoughts, but it can also be of speech or behavior. As I mentioned above, we frequently slip off the track, or we otherwise display these loose associations in conversation. We are also likely to have difficulty in keeping schedules, keeping our living or working spaces organized, and properly attending to medical regimens, etc. That loose association mechanism makes organization of everything difficult for us. Secondly, and this has been in the literature since the 50s, we are exquisitely sensitive. We have a very high degree of sensitivity to high expressed emotion, as they use the term. Because of certain sensitivity, this generally accompanies these disorders, we tend to be particularly susceptible to the effects of others criticizing us or disapproving us or showing they dislike us, as well as any comments that might be expressed with a critical intonation. That is, a tone, their rhythm, their pitch, their intensity, their voice. We're exceedingly sensitive in these social interactions. We also tend not to function overly well in authoritative environments. This is particularly important to mention in a command and control organization, such as the Veterans Administration, because we're very sensitive to those authoritarian aspects, even though we do need a degree of structure, as we all agree. Thirdly, I want to comment on a thing that's called anosognosia. This is from physical medicine. That term, as most of you know, means loss of the ability for one to understand that they in fact have the condition. Most of us with schizophrenia, over 50%, never realize that we actually have the condition, because if you think about it, a delusional thought is one that is a false belief. But you've got to believe in it. And if you believe in it, you can't know it's false, can you? So by definition, this disorder gives us a cognitive mindset by which we cannot, certainly initially, understand that we have the condition. Because of this, it is generally best that others who interact with us not make fun of our belief structure, because to us it's an important belief. Now, if you'd like more information on any of these aspects or approach to coping with serious mental illness, you can find further amplification on the handouts that you've received or on the website that I mentioned. In conclusion, I'd like to take this opportunity very much, with great sincerity, to thank all of the mental health professionals in the Veterans Administration who have assisted me on my road to recovery during the past 34 years. Without your help, for myself and many other veterans, we would not have been able to have a reasonably dignified life, as so many of us can now. Despite having this condition that causes us to think and act erratically at times. We've all learned a lot about living with and caring for persons with these disabilities during the past generation, working together now more in partnership than we have perhaps in the past, while respecting each other's views. Consumers, mental health professionals, and advocates can now forge new approaches to the care of seriously mentally ill persons. By all of us working cooperatively, veterans and others struck down with mental illnesses can hopefully look forward to a smoother road to recovery than the one so many of us have had to travel in the past. Thank you for allowing me to share these thoughts with you today.
Dr. Fries, thank you. That's quite a story. Most veterans have a number of clear ideas about what promotes recovery and what doesn't. Dr. Carling, I know you're in tune with veterans on this issue. What is it they're saying, and what elements and systems are out there that promote recovery?
Well, it's been wonderful to hear about Fred's journey. I've worked in the field of mental health for over 25 years, and it's always been the recovery stories like Fred's that taught me that the greatest gift we have to offer any veteran with a severe mental illness is the gift of hope. What I take from Fred's story is that we're undergoing a revolution in our field, from seeing the people we serve not as helpless patients, not as people whose purpose in life is to receive services, but as citizens with rights and responsibilities, people with disabilities who dream of living successfully in whatever communities they choose, finding and keeping meaningful work, and building social support systems to minimize their need for our services. And we help them to do this not to save money, but to save lives. This revolution is fundamentally changing the role of veterans in our system as they begin to help plan for services with us, evaluate those services, and even provide services like self-help groups. In the process, we're learning a lot about recovery. And as we do, we're beginning to offer services in very different ways, moving out of hospitals and clinics and into the homes and workplaces where our veterans are building new lives. Our service system itself is changing to one that's consumer-directed, family-supporting, outcome and recovery-oriented, clinically competent, and cost-effective. We have a big job ahead of us, working with individual veterans to build new lives while changing the way we provide services in the VA, and that will take a lot more than individual stories. So I want to briefly summarize two areas of research that are providing tremendous help in our understanding of how to make recovery work for veterans. First, let's look at recovery itself. As clinicians, we may have impressions about outcomes and prognosis, but until recently there were only a handful of long-term studies which actually show how people with severe mental illnesses do over time. And the findings in these studies are remarkable. Studies because they are so consistent and they're so hopeful. The most comprehensive study by Harding and others showed that people do not simply deteriorate progressively, as most of us learned in school, but that the course of the illness varies greatly from person to person, exactly as Fred said. In fact, these studies show that while most people need more intensive services in the years immediately following diagnosis, the great majority actually get better over time, often regardless of what treatments they receive over the long haul. Harding concludes that after 20 years, fully 2/3 of those with severe mental illnesses are virtually indistinguishable from the general population, that either full or partial recovery is possible at any stage of the illness, and that the central ingredient that determines whether someone will recover or not is hope, whether we can believe the person can recover. Now, in study after study, we find that people with severe mental illnesses are quite articulate about what helps them recover. What have we learned? From studies about recovery that gathered the experience of consumers, families, psychiatrists, and other clinicians, we find that recovery is an active, ongoing, and highly individual process of recovering not just from the symptoms of severe mental illnesses, but also from the social reaction to those illnesses, whether that takes the form of discrimination or stigma. These reactions can cause as much damage to a veteran's motivation as the illnesses themselves. We've learned that it's crucial to help people learn from their experiences of illness, to learn coping strategies, and to maintain crucial social connections with people and with valued activities, even during crises or hospitalizations. We now know that recovery is a process of finding meaning in your individual experience and then being supported to move on with your life with the kinds of help you need to succeed. The second area of research has to do with patients, perhaps the most fundamental support that we can offer people: decent, safe, and affordable housing. Now, about 15 years ago, we started a program of research called Consumer Preference Studies, asking people what kinds of housing, work, services, and other supports they found most helpful to have meaningful lives. Since then, there have been nearly 100 such studies among the whole diversity of people with the most severe mental illnesses, people receiving treatment in VA settings, in community mental health programs, in shelters, in hospitals, or on the streets, people in the US, in Canada, and a number of other countries. And the results of all these studies are remarkably similar. The overwhelming majority of people, regardless of where they are in the treatment system, want independent housing integrated with people without disabilities. They prefer apartments or home ownership. They value privacy and autonomy over any other aspect of housing. They prefer to live with a friend or a romantic partner rather than others with a psychiatric disability. And they know what they need for services. They want these supports on a 24-hour basis, but they generally do not want service providers living with them. And finally, they identify the biggest barrier to successful housing as their income. This research, along with other studies related to employment or to the kinds of social networks people want, consistently shows that people can recover and that they want normal lives. This presents us with real challenges, since it's always been easier for us to create mental health programs or facilities for veterans to live, work, or socialize in, rather than providing the services that help veterans live, work, and socialize anywhere in the community they'd like to. These findings also challenge us to take the process of individualizing services much more seriously than we ever have before. For if we've learned anything, it's that rather than simply offering veterans the menu of programs that we've designed for them, recovery is a highly individual process, and it only works when we start with the preferences, goals, and unique desires of the person, and take these very, very seriously, and then organize our support accordingly, one person at a time. How does this work? Let's take housing, for example. In a recovery approach, we spend a lot of time working with veterans on their individual housing preferences, showing them lots of options in the community, finding out what's worked for them during any periods of successful living in the community before, helping them connect with other veterans who have traveled the same road they have, and yet who are now successfully living in the community, and then helping them organize a very individual support system through combining the resources of professionals, family, friends, and other community members. Throughout the process, we work hard to have the veteran make the choices rather than us, and we organize ourselves to supporting those folks in the veteran's social network so that over time, professionals become less and less central. We build positive relationships with landlords and housing managers, and we help people get into regular housing with regular leases. Then we provide the kinds of ongoing crisis, case management, treatment, and rehabilitation services to the veteran and to the family that they're telling us will promote success over time. The National Institute of Mental Health, after reviewing a number of outcome studies that show the success of this recovery approach to helping people with the most severe mental illnesses get the housing they need, developed a set of criteria that defines state-of-the-art housing approaches. These standards suggest that the veteran should be the one who's choosing from among a variety of options, that the housing should consist of regular units integrated within the community, that the veteran holds the lease, has the same rights and responsibilities as any other tenant, and can stay as long as he or she desires. Services are individualized, including both professional and peer support, and are available on a 24-hour basis. So it's encouraging that the kinds of advice we're getting from veterans about how we should change our services also seem to be the ways that we can help them enjoy recovery and meaningful lives, which shows that ultimately so much of our success will depend on our ability to listen continuously to the perspectives of veterans themselves as we work together to develop recovery-oriented services.
Dr. Carling, thank you for that. In about 15 minutes or so, we're going to be taking your phone calls. Our guests will be more than happy to answer your questions or take your comments, so jot them down, and when we do open the lines, please give us a call. Right now, we're going to shift our focus to psychiatric rehabilitation and Mo Armstrong. Mo, you have been a patient under VA care, and today you work in the public mental health system for people who receive Medicaid services. You've dedicated your life to caring for people with mental illness like you were cared for, and you believe that the first step in recovery and rehabilitation is connecting with other people. Tell us about yourself, please, and your views on connecting.
Hey, thanks, Rick. There is a real condition called mental illness. I have this psychiatric condition. Over the past 35 years of living with mental illness, I've received mental health services. I've received that care from the Veterans Administration. I'm grateful, and I want to thank anyone who works in the mental health system. Without your care, I'd not be speaking with you today. I would have died. I was homeless when the VA took me in 13 years ago. I chose to go back and start to work as a peer counselor. Eventually, I completed 2 master's degrees, 2 bachelor's degrees. I continued to work in state-funded mental health systems, first as a direct care worker and now as a professional administrator with Vinfen Corporation and the Peer Educators Project. I work setting up and monitoring peer educational support meetings all across Massachusetts. We have over 30 meetings going throughout the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. I and other facilitators have moved from being counselors to being educators. There are more and more people with mental illness working in the mental health system, not just as peer support specialists. We also will be working in traditional staff positions. We will be working side by side with professionals to increase our ability to transform mental illness to new levels of sanity, stability, safety, and sobriety. I've been mentally ill for a long time. I continue to have mental illness. For me, this psychiatric condition never went away. What will be the new roles and skills that mental health practitioners will need to know? I will only lightly cover these new skill sets. I hope you enjoy the handout and use it for your future work. There is a new framework of interacting with people who have mental illness. What are the new steps of interacting? Our job is to see where we, those of us that have mental illness, fit into the new mental health system. The mental health system of care is moving from containment model to rehabilitation and recovery model. What will be the new staff skills that will be needed? I will discuss this and talk with why we need these new skill sets. We are able to save more lives and provide better care to people with mental illness using rehabilitation and recovery techniques. These techniques I learned from Boston University Center for Psychiatric Rehabilitation, but I have modified them. The first foundational value of psychiatric rehabilitation should be a commitment to connect. Connecting with another human being is a skill. Connecting is an underrated skill. Connecting with someone who is coming into our mental health system is very important. And maybe the reason some people haven't gotten into our mental health system of care is they haven't been connected with. As long as we have people in our mental health system, then we still need to keep learning these connecting skills. The outline of this material is taken from Boston University Center for Psych Rehab training on how to be a case manager, but I have built on this subject with my own ideas and experiences and observations so we can learn about connecting from a broader perspective. I'm a person who works in mental health, receives mental health services, and tries to understand the mental health system. I also have a sister who has a mental illness, and I'm also stepfather to 2 daughters with mental illness. So I'm a family member also. Connecting is important because it works. Connecting keeps people in our mental health system and transforms people to become more safe, stable, sane, and sober. Human potential can be developed if the person is connected with. The mental health system is responsible for maintaining the quality of life of clients while creating a learning environment. I hope that if you work in mental health, if you receive services, or if you are a family member, that we can all improve our lives by our time together in mental health. Our healthcare system can be a system of mutual growth of wellness and quality of life. The mental health system should assist in bringing safety, stability, sanity, and sobriety to people, all people. To assist in bringing a person sane, stable, and sober requires a two-way street for communication. People who work in the mental health system can learn how to develop a closer relationship with us, clients and consumers. However, we clients are also learning how to develop a closer relationship with the health system and society. We can remember that, as well with all relationships, there will be ups and downs. Some days we'll feel alienated and discouraged. We can learn to keep coming back and working with people in our programs. People in our mental health programs can learn to keep coming back to our services. And if there ever comes a time when we can no longer work with a specific person in our recovery-oriented programs, then we have an obligation to find the right professional program for them. We can do a referral. We want the system to work. There will be system glitches because there's not enough staff people to help those who need services. The optimal experience is connecting with clients. We understand that many clients, consumers, should want to establish a close bond with professional staff. A problem is that some professionals are taught to have boundaries between clients, consumers, and them. Boundaries mean observing professional ethics while maintaining a humanitarian stance toward people in need of services and care. We try for closeness, respect, and communication. We must learn to forgive and go on with our psychiatric recovery and rehabilitation work when we don't get the response we were looking for. The process of psychiatric recovery and rehabilitation is not therapy. We educate people about the recovery and rehabilitation process. The better we get to know the clients, the more refined the selection and delivery of psychiatric rehabilitation and mental health services. Closeness can work for us, closeness can work for the clients, closeness can work for everyone in our mental health system, but we must learn how to be close. There are 4 types of closeness: physical, emotional, intellectual, and spiritual. Physical closeness is the need for our companionship, just old-fashioned educational friendship. Some professionals will hesitate and not want to become too close. People can demonstrate levels of closeness without losing proper ethical distance. We must remember, as with many relationships, that we have to demonstrate friendship to receive friendship. Physical closeness is based on the body language and how people position themselves. This is not based on physically touching another person. There has to be a genuine sense of caring, not just patting someone on the head while maintaining a position of superiority. Remember that if we go into any conversation with unresolved anger, we will always limit our ability to have a close bond. The need for emotional closeness is based on rapport with people. Professionals can also share their experiences that they feel comfortable about. Remember, most of us who are recipients of mental health services have experienced a lot of emotional pain. However, a person can only take in so much information. Some clients want to tell all that we are feeling in an hour. No professional can absorb that much. We need to learn to pace ourselves. Also, professionals should not usurp the consumer-client role of sharing self-disclosure. Professional self-disclosure is necessary and important, but not dominant to the people who are in our programs. Intellectual closeness is the need to have a shared association with people who have the same interests and opinions. Meanwhile, we might want to discuss some world ideas. Some professionals who work in mental health may want to keep on track. They might not want to discuss philosophies and ideas which don't seem related to the topic of the interview. The value of keeping on track can be appreciated. However, we can brainstorm, we can ramble, we can dream, and we can do this together. Remember, there may be other pressing concerns that the client consumer would first like to talk about. Be gracious, step back, just let people talk. Spiritual closeness is based on talking about intangible essences of life. This may require us to talk about our beliefs, about what is moral and what is true. We can always preface this with discussions from the consumer or client saying something like, "I want you to know me better, so I'd like you to know about my beliefs." These beliefs are personal and not to be used for a position of superiority. Demonstrating understanding is describing accurately to another person his or her ideas, experiences, or beliefs. We cannot become frustrated or overly angry. We have to demonstrate understanding. Self-disclosing is sharing our ideas, experiences, and/or beliefs with another person. We are expected to self-disclose. We must be open to ask the client consumer their opinions and experiences. We need to hear what others have to say. If we don't hear the other person's ideas, experiences, and/or beliefs, then be sure to ask questions. Inspiring is arousing a sense of positive, personal purpose. We have to remember that client consumers are in need of this, and so are people that work in our system. We have all become tired and exhausted from mental illness. The psychiatric condition can also cause extreme physical exhaustion. We need to work with inspiration so that we can become inspirational. We must come in and show clients and consumers consideration and eagerness to start and continue the recovery and rehabilitation program. Discriminating closeness needs is distinguishing whether another person needs or wants to be physically, emotionally, and intellectually or spiritually close to us. Most professionals come from another time in training. We must learn to discriminate how close the professional wants to be with the client consumer. Some people might want to keep large boundaries. We can help bring the client and consumer closer by demonstrating trust. The secret is to let go of the small, unpleasant experiences and remember our entire times together. If we want to be close to another person, then many times that person will generally want to be close to us. We must remember that no matter how hard we try to please some people, there will be those who don't like us. We might find connecting difficult. We should remember that we must learn to be polite, not become discouraged. Connecting is an ongoing process that is part of each of the times that we spend together with each and every person. We must be prepared to keep learning from these ongoing connecting skills. We must practice sharing our ideas, experiences, and/or beliefs. We can learn to accept closeness. Through closeness skills, we're learning compassion. Compassion is learned. Compassion needs renewal and reaffirmation, understanding that we all are suffering. Mental illness is painful. Mental illness is not a character disorder. Mental health is a system set in place to reduce suffering and pain. We must acknowledge that there is pain with a psychiatric condition. We must understand that mental illness is so painful that sometimes people can feel physical pain. Therefore, our programs are places to stop, get calm, rest, and heal. We need places to learn. We need a place to live and sleep. We need to eat a good diet, and we need to get mental illness education. Don't get discouraged. Mental illness is a brain condition and can take a long time to heal. For recovery and rehabilitation to take place, there is not an atmosphere of superiority. In the future, we will share ideas, food, and time together. There are not leaders and followers. We're all going to have to work together. We're going to have to explore together on how to get us sane, stable, safe, and sober.
All right, Mo, thank you very much. We're going to be opening the phone lines in just a few minutes. The number you'll be calling should be on your screen in just a moment, 314-894-5734. That's 314, there it is, 894-5734. Before we hear from you, let's go now to Washington, D.C., and our chief consultant for today's broadcast, Dr. Larry Lehman, for an in-depth look at integrating a recovery-oriented philosophy into traditional mental health practices and at VA strategic goals, clinical practice guidelines, and organizational processes. Dr. Lehman.
There's no conflict either philosophically or practically between a biological, physiological concept of mental disorders and the psychosocial rehabilitation recovery approach. A rehabilitative orientation is based upon the recognition of patients' strengths as well as deficits. The goal of therapy, pharmacotherapy and traditional and modern psychotherapies, including cognitive behavioral approaches, is essentially to diminish deficits and to optimize strengths. Recovery-oriented approaches drive the rehabilitation concept and move it a step further, both in terms of a practical focus on patient functioning, issues of housing, employment, activities of daily living, and also of active partnership of patients and their significant others in planning and implementing therapy. I've always seen psychotherapy as a form of coaching, helping patients to learn how best to help themselves. I believe a lot of what underlies recovery is the kind of attitude and orientation that underlies a good patient-doctor relationship. With that said, it must be acknowledged that what's been presented so far in this program may be, for many mental health professionals, a challenge to traditional training. First and foremost, it requires shifting our views of those with serious mental illnesses from chronically ill to potentially well. It challenges the stigma of mental illness, described in Dr. David Satcher's 1999 Surgeon General's report on mental health, where he states, and I quote, "Stigma reduces patients' access to resources and opportunities, example housing, jobs, and leads to low self-esteem, isolation, and hopelessness. It deprives people of their dignity and interferes with their full participation in society, end quote. Increasingly, research is demonstrating that those who've been diagnosed with serious mental illnesses can and do regain meaning in their lives and purpose in their lives, and that they do successfully rejoin society in normalized roles, and that changes in mental health systems and our communities overall are necessary to facilitate even greater levels of psychosocial recovery. Current and past recipients of mental health services are demanding a greater voice in the design of service delivery systems and in the design of their own treatment and recovery plans. It's becoming increasingly clear that it's the insight and input of these consumers and advocacy groups that are to be credited with many of the emerging mental health system improvements. Although integrating the psychosocial recovery model into our traditional mental health system requires a significant paradigm shift, it's increasingly embedded in our organizational, mission, and policies. For example, goal number 1 of VA's strategic plan is to restore the capability of disabled veterans to the greatest extent possible and to improve the quality of their lives and that of their families. The Undersecretary's Committee on the Care of Veterans with Serious Mental Illnesses has noted the major advances in the treatment of mental illness that have been thoroughly evaluated and widely adopted. The committee has stressed the need to integrate biomedical technology with psychosocial recovery, noting, and I quote again, "The recovery model of psychosocial rehabilitation has demonstrated that all people with mental illness, no matter how impaired initially, can benefit from programs in which their human capacities are expanded through exposure to appropriate work opportunities and constructive community activity," end quote. Among the 9 core mental health services identified by the SMI committee are 3 in the area of psychosocial recovery. These include 1, every veteran deserves humane housing which supports adequate not only to maintain them in the least restrictive environment, but also to encourage improved functioning and community adaptation. 2, rehabilitation and employment programs must also be readily available not only to maximize functioning but also to enhance self-respect and dignity. And 3, the active involvement of families and consumers as partners in the pursuit of recovery is fast becoming a standard of practice in progressive mental health. VA must seize the opportunity to participate in this development. Also, VA's clinical practice guidelines for the treatment of psychosis have been developed with considerable attention to ensuring that psychosocial rehabilitative services are fully assessed and provided in concert with biomedical services. And within each psychosocial approach, these guidelines describe an initial therapeutic dialogue which should take place between the clinician and the patient to ensure the patient's full input into determining his or her rehabilitation goals. VHA's performance measures are currently targeted at ensuring adequate nationwide access to community-integrated mental health services, to include mental health intensive case management teams wherever appropriate based on a population-based needs assessment, and mental health services availability at all community-based outpatient clinics. Yet even with these key strategic goals, clinical practice guidelines, and organizational processes in place, we're still at the earliest stages of integrating biomedical and psychosocial recovery-oriented technologies. While many systemic changes are underway to move mental health services from hospital-based institutional settings to community-based ones, there's also need for a dramatic recovery-oriented paradigm shift in our basic perceptions of and clinical approaches with those diagnosed with serious mental illnesses. Bringing a recovery orientation to mental health services is an ongoing process, and one requiring considerable staff training. This satellite training program is an initial orientation to the paradigm shift we're undertaking. I encourage wide dissemination of this telecast to all mental health staff, with ongoing follow-up discussions, as well as policy and practice reviews. In developing this broadcast, we've taken the positive step of encouraging joint participation by both staff and veterans with serious mental illnesses in the training process. This is to encourage individual medical centers to include veteran participation in both assessing current mental health services and in bringing a recovery orientation to them.
Dr. Lehman, thank you very much for those comments. Now it's your turn. Please give us a call at the number we told you about a moment ago, 314-894-5734. Again, it's 314, as you see on your screen, 894-5734. Our panelists are standing by to answer your questions. And when you do call, please turn down the volume on your television set so we don't get feedback here in the studio. While we're waiting for our first caller, let's follow up on a few important points with our panel. Mo, let's start with you. You had talked about the need to move from containment to recovery, but how is recovery defined?
Well, for me, recovery would be defined, and I'm always looking at what are the personal levels of these levels of sanity, stability, sobriety, and safety. Many times when I was mentally ill, I was not very safe in the community. I didn't understand my own psychiatric condition, so I kind of acted my worst, and I did not have a real commitment to sobriety. So I've had to learn those phases myself, and that's what I always kind of key off of, is how sane, stable, safe, and sober is that person, so that I can kind of be working to always improve those levels of sanity, stability, sobriety, and safety.
Is it possible to lapse in and out of recovery?
The difficulty, I think, that most people with mental health backgrounds have today is they can't work with the episodic and unpredictability of the psychiatric condition. We haven't done a very good job of educating many people who have a mental illness. What is mental illness and how to live with it? So until we do that, we're still falling back on a professional group of people who are trying to shore up those of us that have these conditions. Yes, it's all possible. Yes, it's also difficult, and we have to be prepared over the next 10 years of moving that paradigm shift to an educational model from a counseling or a containment model is going to require some glitches. It's not going to be easy.
Dr. Carly Moe touched upon this a little bit, but what are the elements of recovery in your opinion?
Well, I think we've heard a number of them around the panel today. First, and very significantly, as Mo was talking about, is connecting with others and having the ability to have people continue to connect with people with mental illness and not let them sort of fall through the cracks or get too isolated. In terms of the individual themselves, a critical element of recovery is a person really learning their own story, and through that process learning to develop a sense of personal responsibility for what happens in their life. And that's why staff promoting choices and promoting people managing their own lives is so terribly important. As long as folks are really dependent on staff, they're not going to develop a sense of personal responsibility. Learning coping and wellness strategies, which Fred talked about so eloquently. One of the practical pieces of recovery is having a crisis plan that the person themselves has developed and that people are all buying into around them, whether that's family members or clinicians and so forth. Another one is having valued relationships, meaningful work, decent housing. We've talked a lot about that. And above all, I think having a good system of supports in place that people can rely upon.
Good answer, and you're talking about support. Dr. Freese, yours is an amazing story. I'm interested in knowing what was your family's role in your recovery, and what is the typical family's role in a person's recovery from this illness?
I'm glad you asked that question. Actually, until I was invited to write a 30-page narrative on my own life, I really wasn't able to put the threads together. But the 10 years that I was having these adventures with the episodic relapses and being rehospitalized were times when, as the episode developed, the person with the disorder really doesn't understand they have the disorder, and so they go much further into it before they're caught when somebody picks them up. But then I got married, and having a wife, a fellow traveler who understands that you have a disability and can give you feedback at a point where you might not recognize it yourself, but you can develop a trust relationship with a person who knows you and can see what's developing is exceedingly helpful. I was almost hospitalized again a year ago in the Veterans Hospitals. In fact, we went through a little negotiating with the psychiatrist as to whether or not I would in fact be hospitalized. But the critical thing is the relationships with other persons that I talked about, and developing ways to, as Mo says, connect from where you are to where they are, and to be able to trust their feedback to you at a point that comes well before the black and white car comes to pick you up is exceedingly helpful as a method of coping with this disability. Now, am I making any sense here? Because sometimes I tend to get out into the cosmos and normals.
You wanted to add to that, Paul?
Yeah, let me add, because Fred, you've done so much work nationally with families and with supporting the needs of families. And one of the things we've learned is that the last thing you want to do in a recovery approach is just to focus so much on the individual that you forget that the most enduring source of support for them in their lives is their families. So fortunately, Fred and others around the country have been helpful in developing all kinds of educational and support programs for families. And the way we think about this is supporting the supporters, so that when a person really needs some help, that family is grounded, taking care of itself, and therefore able to reach out and intensify their support for the individual when that's needed.
I'd also like to say something else I think is very important here. When you ask the question, what are the elements of recovery, I think that it is important to recognize that it depends on the individual and how disabled they are. If I am so disabled that I really believe that aliens are communicating with me and that's all I'm going to listen to, that is a very different stage of recovery than if I've got a job and tend to have episodic relapse and this sort of thing. And so when persons such as the 200,000 seriously mentally ill persons abandoned in the streets, homeless, and in the missions, many of whom are veterans, don't realize they have an illness and we can't get help to them, that's one stage. And my own feeling, and I just finished an article on this in Psychiatric Services, we need to get help to those persons because they're so disabled that they can't understand they need that help. On the other hand, as they begin to recover, that's when stronger elements of autonomy in the recovery process begin to kick in, and we need to give more responsibility to that individual with the disorder.
Well, I definitely have more questions for all of you, but we need to give some time to our callers. We do have a call now coming in from Miami. Caller, please go ahead.
Hi, I just want to tell you that I really enjoyed this program. I love the ideas that have been expressed. I come back from a generation in the 70s where humanistic treatment was very common and valued. In an age, though, where documentation, being accountable, goal setting, the need to reach objectives within a specific short amount of time frame, all these factors, to me, become an obstacle to the treatment sometimes of patients. And I hope that as this new paradigm is being developed or evolves, that this will also be considered, that a clinician is oftentimes in a situation where paperwork becomes more important. I mean, I'm sorry to say that, but that's the reality sometimes. But I do love the idea of what you're expressing. I believe in everything you're saying, and I appreciate it. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much for that call. Any comment on that,
Yes,
gentlemen?
I have a very strong comment on that. The watchword, if it's not documented, it's not done, is way been overdone in these bureaucratic mental health systems, both in state hospitals and the Veterans Administration. And yours is a very good point. We should not have the place where somebody comes up to us and we say, can't help you because I'm documenting now and they've got an inspection coming up, which happens all the time. Hopefully, this new paradigm will free you from the shackles of having to sit there and be documenting all this stuff for these inspectors and have more latitude to use your talents and skills in interacting with those of us in recovery. And speaking as a consumer advocate, I'll be the first one to argue with these credentialing agencies that this thing is overdone. We ought to focus much more on outcomes of the individuals than we do on what's documented properly. Did I make myself clear on that?
As Fred said a few minutes ago, we shouldn't focus ourselves excessively on documentation when it isn't needed. Similarly, we need to get the person out into the community as soon as they're able to get out there. But the psychosocial approaches should begin in tandem with the biomedical approaches as soon as the patient is able to benefit from them, and certainly that will be before their point of discharge and must continue after their point of discharge into the community. After their point of discharge into the community.
Dr. Lehman, thank you very much. We are having a few problems with our audio. We're trying to correct that. We do have another caller on the line, however, from Palo Alto. Caller, please go ahead.
Hi. A veteran just this morning said, for years they've been telling me to accept my illness, that I'm sick. Now people are telling me I can recover. His question was, where do I go with that?
Well, I think what we have to talk about is realistic levels of recovery. As a guy who has been mentally ill for a long time, we have to look at that. What we don't really seem to do well in our mental health system is we don't really seem to set aside both the time and the money that are going to be needed to probably provide some kind of long-range, long-term care. But that care isn't going to be a lot of inpatient time anymore. It's going to be based on more prevention, education, and outreach. By the time somebody has fallen apart so desperately that they need to be in the hospital, we've really failed as a mental health system to provide that prevention, education, and outreach. I maintain that the future and best prevention, education, and outreach that we haven't utilized much is finding other people with psychiatric conditions and training them to be adjuncts and workers in our own mental health system, so that people who have another level of recovery can share paths and roads and discoveries with people who aren't doing as well. Not to be some kind of new police force, not to set up some kind of new behavioral modification, trickery in our own mental health system, but to be there as support and educating side by side with the people who have these conditions. There's a lot of shared similarities with characteristics of illness, and there's also a lot of shared experiences. We need to start to learn from each other. Best way I know how to do it, some professional support, some peer support, and professional and some peer support all working together.
I'd like to say something about that too, if I could. That's a very good question. How can you be disabled and recover? I know Mo agrees with that. We have a disability. Recovery does not mean to turn into a normal person. It means to be able to function with your disability. Learning the nature of your disability is what recovery is all about, and how to function maximally in spite of that disability is what we're talking about. So I think your question went right to the essence of the difference between recovery and normalization, which is not what we're talking about here.
I used to say all the time, I can be mentally ill, but I don't have to act crazy. And when I was at my worst, I thought I was at my best. I was homeless. Matter of fact, the Bay Area, I'm still known in Berkeley and some of these other areas out there as a great spare change artist. I would not call what I'm doing today anything like what I was doing then. So, you know, I say I can be mentally ill, but I don't have to act crazy. And I keep that with me. That's one of those little Mo reaffirmations all the time that I have to remind myself. I was at my worst. I mean, there were people that were at one time terrified. This hulking guy on the street, weird and loud and chasing people around. And, you know, that wasn't good. You know, I still have the mental illness. The mental illness for me never seemed to go away. Can't sleep, agitated, anxious, worried all the time. But I'm not terrifying my friends, the neighbors, the community. I was your worst case scenario. I mean, I could take you to Telegraph Avenue in Berkeley, and there's probably people who still remember me. You know, I can be mentally ill, but I don't have to act crazy.
You don't act embarrassed or ashamed of what you've just said, but how big is the stigma still out there against mental illness?
It is huge. It is huge, but you know, I have hope. I think it was only 10 years ago, women with breast cancer never talked about breast cancer. Now they have marches in the streets. You know, I think we will see the same day in our own mental health system. What's strange is that when we actually open up the opportunities for people to get care, for people to get treatment, for people to discuss mental illness, the numbers don't go up. My phone isn't jumping off the hook, people saying, my God, Mo, I'm